Scott woke up with a heavy head. Oh yes, they had a good time yesterday. He and his friend Ron sat in a bar at first. Then they went to a nightclub. They left the club with the girls to ride around the city at night. But something went wrong. Specifically, the road was bad. When was there a speed bump there? In short, something threw Scott's car. He literally lost control for a second. And then there was the store with a huge glass showcase. Scott literally drove into this showcase. At first, he was even scared by the impact and the sound of broken glass. But then the fright went away. Ron laughed. The girls giggled because panties and bras were artistically arranged on the windshield. They ended up in an expensive lingerie boutique. Then the police arrived. Scott and his friends were taken to the police station. It's unknown how it would have ended if it weren't for his father. He was an important person in the city. The chief prosecutor, judge, and mayor were friends with him, all because Mr. Brockett had the largest construction business in the city. In short, the father bailed out his son, but nagged him all the way, saying he was a drunk and a lazybones. That's enough, Scott said with a stutter. How much does that showcase cost? Well, let's pay. You're going to pay? Have you earned a single penny? Mr. Brockett got angry. You're almost 30 and you're still living off me. When are you going to show up at the office? Did I pay for you to study at the college for nothing? I'll show up. Scott nodded in agreement and yawned. His father realized that a serious conversation with his son would not work and let him sleep. The next evening, Scott finally came out of his room, rubbing his temples. Mr. Brockett had just returned from work. Seeing his son, he frowned. Did you just wake up? Good job, here. Dad, forgive me, Scott said with remorse. Retaliation, I won't do it again. The father smiled and sighed heavily. Okay, I've paid for the showcase. The damages and the car will be fixed in a couple of days. That's great, Scott rejoiced. Just decide whether to give you the keys or not now. Scott sighed well. There's nothing he can do. He'll have to obey his father's will. Mr. Brockett raised his son alone from the age of 10 after his wife died from a serious illness while he was at work a governess. And a housekeeper looked after his son. Mr. Brockett often stayed at work for days, leaving his son in the care of others as his son entered adolescence. He became rude and insolent, but Miss Brockett was too busy earning money to pay attention to him. Additionally, his personal life was quite active as well, with one mistress after another. Nonetheless, he always fulfilled his son's desires and believed that providing him with the best of everything was the most important thing. He assumed his son's character would improve with age, so Scott grew up on his 18th birthday. Scott crashed the first car which his father had given him, but Mr. Brockett soon bought him a new one. Scott even finished architectural college. But this did not make him any wiser. He preferred drinking, partying, and girls. Mr. Brockett repeatedly tried to involve Scott in his business, but he always found excuses not to work. Why bother? He had plenty of his father's money, but Mr. Brockett wanted to pass on his business to him. He believed that if he persisted in pulling Scott into business, soon he would become his right hand. After the incident with the lingerie store, Scott finally got a job. As promised to his father, he enjoyed the office, especially because there were many beautiful girls. Diane, his father's current mistress, and the secretary was particularly appealing to him. Scott wouldn't mind stealing her away from him. However, Diane was not foolish and knew who was in charge. She wouldn't leave Mr. Brockett for his spoiled son. One day, Scott entered his father's reception area, sat in a chair, put his feet on the table, and stared at Diane, who was handling correspondence. He carefully studied the deep neckline of her blouse. Listen, Diane, don't you want to have a glass of wine tonight in a romantic setting? He asked casually. I don't want to. Diane smiled. Aren't you afraid that I'll tell him that you're pestering me? Then you'll get out of here and you'll go from being a love to being dumped. Laughed. Scott, don't forget, I'm his only son, his hope and support. He wanted to say something else, but the door to the reception opened and a pretty blonde girl in a cleaning lady's uniform peeked in. Diane, I didn't water your flowers today. Can I do it now? She asked. Oh, let's do it later. I'm finishing my work. Now I don't want to be distracted. Diane shook her head. Okay, no problem. The girl smiled and disappeared behind the door. Scott looked at Diane in surprise. I don't understand. Do we have a new cleaner? Where did that old lady go? He asked. Diane, Helena got sick. Jody is here temporarily, so. Her name is Jody, Scott said dreamily. Diane just sighed and wondered if Scott would finally leave her alone and focus on this girl. Why not? Jody is simple, clearly not smart. The rich guy will wink at her, and Jody will melt, and she'll feel more comfortable. Finally, she's a beautiful girl. Diane winked at Scott. Go for it. I'm not interested in cleaners, grinned Scott, but Jody had clearly caught his interest. That same day, he called her to his cabinet. Why is there dust on my windowsills? He asked the girl sternly. She raised her eyebrows in surprise. That's impossible. I cleaned everything today. She then ran her finger along the windowsill, which was perfectly clean. Really, Scott said, as if he were surprised. And after a pause, he laughed. Okay. Jody, relax. I just called you here because you're such a beautiful girl. I'm impressed. Maybe we can go out tonight. I know a great restaurant. No, sorry, Jody replied dryly. I have other things to do tonight. And she left the office. Scott just sneered contemptuously. How dare some cleaner refuse him? He'll have her in his bed in no time just for the sport of it. In the following days, he kept making suggestive comments to Jody and winking at her when they made... But she pretended not to notice this pampered son of a rich daddy one day. A funny incident occurred. Scott walked into his office. And suddenly started yelling, and everyone rushed over. It turned out there was a small spider sitting on his chair. Get rid of it right now, he shouted at Jody. Would you let dust with spiders in here? The girl immediately removed the spider and silently left the office. Don't worry. Diane winked at her. Scott is just terrified of spiders since childhood. That's why he freaked out. Jody smiled. He was so self-confident, but he was afraid of a spider. Scott did not calm down and continued to pursue Jody. Vacations, another day, he sort of accidentally touched her on the bottom of her back. The girl turned around and slapped him hard in the face. Everyone in the office who saw it froze. That's it, Diane thought. We need to find another cleaner. He'll do everything to get rid of Jody. But Scott rubbed his cheek and whispered to Jody, big mistake. You'll regret it. Then he smiled and cheerfully addressed the stunned employees. Why aren't working? Everyone back to their places. He's the owner's son. Therefore, he has the right to give orders. He's the owner's son. Therefore, he has the right to give orders, he thought to himself smugly. Since that day, he harbored anger towards Jody. Simply firing her was not in his plans. He thought about how to get revenge on the uncommunicative girl. Of course, Mr. Brockett was not aware of his son's behavior. He decided not to delve into it. His son went to work, and thank God. One day, Jody was cleaning Mr. Brockett's office while he was away. It was already evening, and Diane was finishing up a document rushing. Scott peeked into his father's office and saw Jody bent over, wiping the legs of the chairs. Scott assessed her from behind. Suddenly, Diane called out to him, and hearing her voice, Jody turned around and blushed. It was Scott again. Diane, you can go. Scott commanded, walked into the office, and firmly closed the door behind him. He walked on the freshly cleaned floor and plopped into his father's chair, silently watching Jody. She kept working silently with the mop. So you don't like me? Scott asked quietly, squinting and looking at the girl. Don't like me? Scott asked quietly, squinting and looking at the girl, and then his gaze slid to the side. There was a huge vase standing by the wall. His father had brought it several years ago at some auction in London. The vase was expensive. Jody, why aren't you talking? Don't you like me? No, she snapped. Well, then don't get offended. He laughed. The next moment, he took the vase in his hands and smashed it with all his might on the floor. The sound of glass ringing could be heard and the shards scattered in different directions. What have you done? Exclaimed Jody. But suddenly Scott blushed, even clenched his fists in anger and yelled in a bad voice. Why did you break the vase? Who asked you to touch it with your clumsy hands? Jody, hearing this, even recoiled, then froze. She couldn't find words to say because of such blatant lies. Diane and a couple of other employees rushed into the office. Scott emotionally told them that the cleaning lady wiped the vase, then dropped it. I asked her not to touch it. It cost millions, Scott said, choking with anger. And this fool climbed with a rake. Scott, you're lying. Suddenly, Jody said clearly and loudly, you broke it yourself in front of my eyes. What? Scott roared. How dare you accuse me? Who are you? Call the police right now. Let them draw up a report on the damage. I saw her do it on purpose. But Diane convinced her not to involve the police in the matter. Let Mr. Brockett decide for himself. Soon he appeared in the office. Upon seeing the fragments of the vase, his hands trembled. What is this? He exclaimed. I paid a tidy sum for the broken showcase of the store, and then a vase which cost me as much as a new car. Scott immediately told his version of events, and Jody tried in vain to convince the boss that she was not involved. I believe my son, said Mr. Brockett dryly. It's too late already. We will deal with everything tomorrow. See you at home. Scott stated that Jody was careless in her duties, and that many in the office were talking about it. Mr. Brockett only shrugged and said that Jody had been looking like a responsible girl, but isn't necessary to punish her to teach others a lesson, offered Scott vindictively. The next day, Mr. Brockett called Jody into his office. I don't know how it happened that you broke this vase at cars, but you will have to compensate for its cost. Otherwise, I will report it to the police, said the boss. It cost $2,000. How much? Jody turned pale. But I'm not guilty. I didn't break it. I've heard that already. Mr. Brockett interrupted her and that my son broke it. But Scott also said to me that you chased him the last days, and you are careless about your duties. Jody cried. I don't want to hear anything, said the boss. Oh, I give you a month to find the necessary amount and you're fired. Shocked, Jody left the boss's cabinet. What did he say? Diane looked at her questioningly. I owe money, Jody whispered, for a vase that I didn't even touch. And also, Mr. Brockett said that many people were not satisfied with my work. Diane, are you too? Jody? I'm sorry, but here everyone is for themselves. The secretary lowered her eyes. Jody realized that she would not find the truth here. The girl left the office, sat on a bench, and cried. Mr. Brockett is a good person, but why does he believe his scoundrel son? However, what else could it be? Blood is thicker than water, and everything had not been going well for her lately. Soon she will have to pay for her studies. She thought she would save up the required amount with a part-time job, but now she even owed. The girl sighed heavily. What should she do now? Scott just decided to destroy her because she refused him. Unfortunately, Mr. Brockett didn't want to listen. Hey, clumsy cleaner, she heard from the car that stopped next to her. Scott looked out of the window. Why are you so sad? Are you thinking about money? Jody didn't answer him and walked as if she didn't notice, while Scott drove slowly next to her. Girl. I can help, he shouted. Come to the hotel room tonight, and we will make a deal. Suddenly, Jody stopped and looked closely at Scott. And make a deal? She asked thoughtfully. Exactly. Licking his lips, Scott said, and his eyes gleamed in anticipation of a close trophy. I'll be there. Jody suddenly agreed. Swim and hotel. Scott said he was waiting for her at the Central Hotel in the city at 7 o'clock in the evening. Get ready, he winked at her. You have to try hard to make up for your guilt. Jody shuddered with disgust and sighed, but smiled in response. Scott laughed and drove away in his expensive car. As Jody walked through the city, deep in thought, a plan ripened in her mind. At exactly 7 o'clock, there was a knock on the door of the room where Scott had comfortably settled on the double bed. He lazily got up and went to the door, carelessly tying his robe. Ah, you're here, he drooled upon seeing Jody. Come in, undress. What are you standing there for? Take off your skirt, your sweater, whatever else you've got on. Oh my God, how are you dressed? Where do they sell such rags? At the store, Jody calmly replied. Can I use the bathroom? I'll be quick. Well, go ahead, grumbled Scott. What's that bag you're carrying? In Jody's hands was a small travel bag. There's a surprise in there, the girl smiled. I promise you'll like it. Okay, go ahead. I'm waiting for you, smirked Scott. Jody emerged from the bathroom a couple of minutes later as promised. She held her hands behind her back. Scott was laying on the bed, his robe open. The girl blushed slightly at the sight of his naked body. He raised his eyebrows. Why are you still in your clothes? And what are you hiding behind your back? It's my surprise, Jody calmly replied. In the next second, the girl stretched her hands forward. In her palms sat a huge spider, hairy black. It was slightly moving its scary legs. What is this? Scott whispered, turning pale. Take it away. Feet paralyzed his hands and feet. Cold, sticky sweat appeared on his forehead. Yet Scott had been afraid of spiders since childhood. He had even undergone treatment for arachnophobia, but it didn't help much. Of course, dear. Jody smiled, but first you'll tell me everything on camera. What do I say? That you broke that vase and why you did it. Go to hell. Okay, I'll go, but that little one will stay here, said Jody, and carefully placed the spider on the bed. It quickly ran to Scott, who literally squealed in fear. Jody caught the spider. Speak, she demanded, pointing her phone camera at Scott and turning on the video recording. She held the spider in one hand, the phone in the other. Oh, please tie your rope. It was me who had broken the vase in my father's office, and then blamed it on Jody. And why? The girl prompted him. Because she refused me. Scott sobbed, glancing at the spider. Go on, demanded Jody. What do you mean? Isn't it clear? Tell me why you called me to the hotel, said the girl and brought the spider closer to Scott. Scott got angry, but looking at the spider, he spoke more calmly. I wanted to teach you a proper behavior. No one has ever refused me, so who should pay for the vase? For me. Jody smiled, then she quickly grabbed the bag with a special container, put the spider inside, and ran out of the room before Scott could recover from his fear. The girl walked around the city with a smile on her face. She'd come up with a good plan, and the spider had helped her so much. Yesterday she managed to take Blade unnoticed. Blade was a huge spider, but one that only looked scary on the outside, but was actually kind, affectionate, and non-poisonous. And with his help, she had skillfully extracted a confession from an arrogant rich guy. Now she just needed to show the recording to Mr. Brockett to prove her innocence in breaking the vase. So with Blade near her bag, Judy arrived at the office. Mr. Brockett was surprised to see her. Have you already collected the money? He asked. No, Judy answered challengingly. I've collected the evidence that proves my innocence. And she showed Mr. Brockett the video. Oh, how disgusting. The boss scowled. My son has completely lost his mind. Jody, please forgive me. Forgive me. That's the last straw anyway. Did you threaten him? Judy said, as if in surprise. Do you think I could? No, he told me everything himself. But why? Asked Mr. Brockett. He'll tell you himself. Jody smiled, and I'll keep this video so that there are no more complaints against me. Saying this, the girl headed for the door. That's Jody. Mr. Brockett called out to her. Maybe you'll come back to work. I've asked the employees. Everyone was satisfied with you. Our permanent cleaner seems unable to return to her duties. Thank you, but I can't. Jody shook her head. I already have another job. And she left. She'd already been offered a part-time job at the zoo in her future profession, and the girl agreed. It is easier to work with animals and insects. They are more honest. After an honest conversation with his son, Mr. Brockett laughed heartily. Jody chose a very clever way to handle everything. She's a smart girl, and it's time for you to smart too, son, he finally said to Scott. But I'm not a fool, Scott grumbled. I know, but the army will make a real man out of you. Mr. Brockett Petrovich chuckled. Dad, Army? Are you kidding me? Scott exclaimed in horror. Mr. Brockett only grinned at this exclamation. And now Scott is in the army, gaining life wisdom, willpower, and training his body.